8,000 miles from London, in the frigid waters of the South Atlantic, lies a chain of windswept islands that most people had never heard of until 1982. The Falkland Islands, home to just 1,800 people and millions of sheep, seemed like the last place on Earth that would spark a war between two nations. Yet for 74 days in 1982, these remote islands became the center of a conflict that would reshape British politics, topple an Argentine military dictatorship, and prove that the age of colonial wars was far from over. The story begins not in 1982, but 149 years earlier, when Britain first claimed sovereignty over the Falklands in 1833. Argentina had always disputed this claim, insisting the islands they called Las Malvinas rightfully belonged to them. For nearly 150 years, this dispute simmered in the background of international diplomacy, occasionally surfacing in United Nations debates but never erupting into violence. The islanders themselves, known as Kelpers, were overwhelmingly of British descent and fiercely loyal to the Crown. They spoke English, used British currency, and considered themselves as British as anyone living in Yorkshire or Scotland. By 1982, Argentina was ruled by a military junta led by General Leopoldo Galtieri. The country was in crisis, with inflation soaring above 600%, unemployment rising, and massive protests against the military government becoming increasingly common. Galtieri and his fellow generals desperately needed something to unite the country and distract from their economic failures. The Falklands, or Las Malvinas as Argentines called them, represented the perfect solution. Reclaiming these islands would tap into deep nationalist sentiment and potentially save their failing regime. What the Argentine generals didn't fully understand was the political situation in Britain. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was facing her own crisis of popularity. Her aggressive economic policies had led to mass unemployment and social unrest. Her approval ratings had plummeted to just 25%, making her one of the most unpopular prime ministers in British history. Like Galtieri, she needed something to revive her political fortunes, though she had no idea that salvation would come from a conflict 8,000 miles away. The British government had been sending mixed signals about their commitment to the Falklands. In 1981, Defense Secretary John Nott announced plans to withdraw HMS Endurance, the Royal Navy's only permanent presence in the South Atlantic. To the Argentines, this seemed like a clear indication that Britain was losing interest in defending the islands. British diplomats had also been discussing the possibility of transferring sovereignty to Argentina while allowing the islanders to remain under British administration, a complex arrangement similar to Hong Kong's status with China. These diplomatic discussions gave Galtieri false confidence that Britain would not fight for the islands. The Argentine military leadership convinced themselves that any British response would be purely diplomatic. They believed that by presenting the world with a fait accompli, they could force Britain to negotiate from a position of weakness. They were catastrophically wrong. On March 19, 1982, Argentine scrap metal dealers landed on South Georgia, another British territory 800 miles southeast of the Falklands, and raised the Argentine flag. This seemingly minor incident was actually the first move in Argentina's carefully planned invasion strategy. The dealers were accompanied by Argentine Marines in civilian clothes, though this wouldn't be discovered until later. The real invasion began at dawn on April 2, 1982. Argentine naval commandos landed at Mullet Creek, 4 miles south of Port Stanley, the Falklands capital. They moved inland under cover of darkness, while Argentine amphibious forces prepared to land at York Bay. The British garrison consisted of just 68 Royal Marines under the command of Major Mike Norman. They were outnumbered more than 20 to 1. Governor Rex Hunt, the British administrator of the islands, made the agonizing decision to surrender after just a few hours of fighting. The Royal Marines had fought bravely, but resistance was hopeless against such overwhelming odds. Argentina had achieved its objective with minimal casualties, and Galtieri's government celebrated what they saw as a bloodless victory that would unite the nation and secure their political future. The news reached London in the early hours of April 2. Margaret Thatcher was woken with reports that British territory had been invaded and British subjects were now under foreign occupation. Her initial reaction was one of fury, not just at Argentina, but at her own military and intelligence services for failing to prevent the invasion despite clear warning signs. Parliament was recalled for an emergency Saturday session on April 3, something that hadn't happened since the Suez crisis in 1956. The mood in the House of Commons was explosive. Opposition leaders demanded to know how the government had allowed British territory to be invaded. Some called for Thatcher's resignation. Defense Secretary John Nott offered to resign, acknowledging the intelligence failures that had made the invasion possible. But Thatcher saw opportunity in crisis. Rising to address Parliament, she announced that a Royal Navy task force would sail immediately to retake the islands. The people of the Falkland Islands, like the people of the United Kingdom, are an island race, she declared. Their way of life is British, their allegiance is to the Crown. It is the wish of the British people and the duty of Her Majesty's government to do everything that we can to uphold that right. What followed was one of the most remarkable military mobilizations in modern British history. Within days, the Royal Navy assembled a task force of over 100 ships. Aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible were loaded with Harrier jump jets. Troop ships were hastily converted from cruise liners, including the luxury liner Canberra, which was renamed the Great White Whale by the troops who sailed aboard her. The human cost of preparing for war was immediate and personal. Thousands of servicemen said goodbye to their families, not knowing if they would return. Wives and mothers watched their husbands and sons sail away to fight for islands most had never heard of. The media coverage was intense, with television cameras capturing emotional scenes as ships departed Portsmouth and other naval bases. Argentina, meanwhile, was celebrating. Massive crowds filled the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, cheering Galtieri and his generals. The invasion had indeed unified the country, at least temporarily. Argentine newspapers proclaimed a great victory, and many believed that Britain would eventually negotiate rather than fight a war so far from home. But both sides were making critical miscalculations. Argentina believed Britain lacked the will and capability to project military power across 8,000 miles of ocean. Britain believed Argentina would back down when faced with superior naval power. Both were wrong, and this mutual miscalculation would lead to a brutal conflict that neither side truly wanted. The British task force faced enormous logistical challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. Every bullet, every meal, every spare part had to be transported across thousands of miles of some of the world's roughest seas. The nearest British base was Ascension Island, still 4,000 miles from the Falklands. Ships had to be loaded not just with weapons and ammunition, but with everything needed to sustain a military force in one of the world's most remote locations. As the task force sailed south, diplomatic efforts continued. American Secretary of State Alexander Haig shuttled between London and Buenos Aires, trying to find a peaceful solution. But both sides had painted themselves into corners. Thatcher couldn't be seen to reward aggression with territorial concessions. Galtieri couldn't withdraw without losing face and probably his government. The first shots of the war were fired not by ships or planes, but by a nuclear submarine. On May 2, HMS Conqueror torpedoed the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano, sinking her with the loss of 323 lives. The attack was controversial because the Belgrano was outside the exclusion zone Britain had declared around the islands and appeared to be sailing away from the conflict area. The sinking of the Belgrano escalated the conflict dramatically. Argentina responded by launching Exocet missile attacks on British ships. On May 4, HMS Sheffield was struck by an Exocet fired from an Argentine super-tendered aircraft. The sophisticated French-made missile punched through the ship's hull and started fires that eventually forced the crew to abandon ship. 20 British sailors died, and the image of Sheffield burning and listing became one of the war's most iconic photographs. These losses brought home the reality that this was not going to be a bloodless victory for either side. The weapons being used were among the most advanced in the world, capable of sinking ships and killing dozens of men in seconds. Both sides were learning that modern warfare could be devastatingly swift and deadly. The British landings at San Carlos Water on May 21 marked the beginning of the ground campaign. Under cover of darkness, thousands of British troops went ashore on the western side of East Falkland. The landing was a tactical masterpiece, achieved with complete surprise despite Argentine forces controlling the high ground around the landing site. But daylight brought Argentine air attacks that turned San Carlos water into what British forces grimly nicknamed Bomb Alley. Argentine pilots, many of them young conscripts barely out of flight training, pressed home attacks with suicidal courage. Flying low to avoid British radar and surface-to-air missiles, they swept into the anchorage and released their bombs at point-blank range. The frigate HMS Ardent was hit by multiple bombs and had to be abandoned. The destroyer HMS Coventry was sunk by Argentine A4 Skyhawks. The cargo ship Atlantic Conveyor, carrying vital helicopters and supplies, was struck by an Exocet missile. The loss of the helicopters aboard Atlantic Conveyor would force British troops to march across the difficult terrain of East Falkland rather than being airlifted to their objectives. What the world didn't know at the time was how close Britain came to defeat during these air attacks. Many Argentine bombs failed to explode because the pilots were flying so low that the bombs didn't have time to arm before impact. If the bombs had detonated properly, several more British ships would have been sunk, potentially making the campaign impossible to continue. The march across East Falkland became an epic of endurance. British troops, loaded down with heavy equipment, struggled across boggy terrain in bitter cold and driving rain. They fought battles at Goose Green and Mount Longdon, slowly pushing the Argentine forces back toward Port Stanley. The fighting was fierce and personal, often conducted at close quarters with bayonets and grenades. Argentine troops were poorly equipped and badly led, but many fought with desperate courage. Young conscripts from the warm provinces of northern Argentina found themselves shivering in trenches on barren mountains, facing professional British soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of warfare. Many Argentine soldiers were barely 18 years old, far from home and frightened, but they held their positions until overwhelmed. The final phase of the war came with the British assault on the mountains surrounding Port Stanley. In a series of night attacks, British forces captured Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Mount Harriet, and finally Mount Tumbledown. The fighting was savage, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Hand-to-hand combat was common as positions changed hands multiple times. On June 14, 1982, Argentine forces in Port Stanley surrendered. General Mario Menendez, the Argentine military governor of the islands, signed the surrender document aboard HMS Fearless. After 74 days, the Falklands War was over. Britain had lost 255 men, Argentina 649. The islands were back under British control, but the cost had been enormous for both nations. The Falklands remain British today, but the dispute with Argentina continues. Every few years, usually when facing domestic difficulties, Argentine politicians revive claims to Las Malvinas. The islands have become prosperous through fishing and oil exploration, but they remain one of the most remote and expensive territories for Britain to defend. The war's legacy lives on in the veterans who fought there. Many British soldiers suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and the suicide rate among Falklands veterans is tragically high. Argentine veterans have also struggled with the psychological wounds of defeat and the knowledge that they were sent to fight by leaders who cared more about political survival than their lives. The Falklands War was the last successful amphibious invasion in modern military history. It proved that small, professional forces could still defeat larger but poorly trained armies. It demonstrated the continued importance of naval power and showed how modern weapons could make warfare more deadly than ever before. Perhaps most importantly, the Falklands War showed that in the modern world, even the most remote territories can become flashpoints for major conflicts. The untold truth behind Britain and Argentina's battle is that it was a war neither side really wanted, fought over islands that most people couldn't find on a map, but which became a matter of national honor for both countries. It was a reminder that in international relations, miscalculation and wounded pride can still lead to war, even in an age when such conflicts seem anachronistic and pointless.